The gunshot cracked through the mountain darkness like thunder-splitting stone, and Jonas Garrett dropped flat against the rocky ground as three shadows moved between him and his cattle herd, their intentions as black as the moonless night surrounding them all. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed himself into the sparse cover of a juniper bush, the sharp scent of its needles filling his nostrils. The year was 1876, and cattle rustling had become as common as breathing in the Colorado Territory, but Jonas had sworn on his father's grave that no man would steal what he had worked so hard to build. His homestead sat tucked into the eastern slopes of the Rockies, a rough-hewn cabin surrounded by grazing land that he had cleared with his own 2 hands over the past 5 years. Those 30 head of cattle represented everything he owned in this world besides his horse, his rifle, and the clothes on his back. The Rustlers were speaking now, their voices carrying on the night wind. Jonas counted 3 distinct tones, rough and confident, men who had done this before and expected no resistance. They had not counted on him sleeping light, had not expected him to hear the restless lowing of his cattle and come running with his Winchester rifle clutched in his calloused hands. "Get them moving," one voice hissed. "We need to be 5 miles gone before dawn." Jonas shifted his weight carefully, drawing the rifle tight against his shoulder. The darkness was absolute, clouds covering even the stars, and he could barely make out the shapes of the men against the marginally lighter sky. His muscles coiled tight beneath his buckskin shirt, every inch of his 6'4" frame tensed and ready. Years of living alone in the mountains had hardened him, his shoulders broad as an axe handle, his arms thick with the kind of strength that came from wrestling logs and breaking horses and surviving winters that could kill a lesser man. His dark hair hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord to keep it from his eyes. He took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash lit the night for one brilliant instant, and he saw them clearly. 3 men scrambling for cover, their faces twisted with surprise and fury. Jonas rolled sideways as return fire peppered the ground where he had been lying, the bullets whining off rocks and kicking up dirt. He came up behind a boulder and fired again, then again, working the lever action as fast as his hands could move. The fight was chaos and noise and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jonas could not see well enough to aim properly, could only fire toward the muzzle flashes of their guns and hope his shots came close enough to drive them off. His blood sang in his veins, fear and fury mixing into something primal and fierce. These were his cattle, his land, his life they were trying to steal. One of the rustlers cried out, a yelp of pain that told Jonas at least one bullet had found its mark. The other 2 returned fire with renewed desperation, and Jonas felt something hot tear across his upper arm, a burning line of pain that made him grunt through clenched teeth. But he did not stop firing, did not give them a moment to regroup or advance. Finally, mercifully, he heard the thunder of hooves as they retreated, the 3 rustlers mounting their horses and fleeing into the darkness. Jonas remained frozen behind his boulder for long minutes, listening for any sign of a trick, but there was only the gradually settling herd and the harsh rasp of his own breathing. When dawn came gray and cold, Jonas found blood on the rocks where the wounded rustler had fallen, a trail of it leading away into the scrub. He also found his own arm torn and bleeding, though the wound was shallow enough. He bound it with strips torn from his spare shirt and spent the morning calming his cattle and checking that none had been stolen. His hands shook slightly as he worked, the aftermath of fear and adrenaline leaving him hollowed out and weary. He did not know that his life was about to change completely. He did not know that even as he tended his herd under that pale morning sky, a woman was riding toward his mountain, driven by desperation and determination, her own story about to collide with his in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. Her name was Catherine Wells, though most people called her Kate, and she'd been riding for 3 days straight when she finally spotted the thin trail of smoke rising from Jonas Garrett's chimney. Her horse was exhausted, its sides heaving, and Kate herself was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. But she could not stop. Not yet, not until she had put enough distance between herself and the town of Leadville to feel even marginally safe. The problem had started with her father's debt. Samuel Wells had been a good man, a kind man, but he had also been a gambler. And when the fever took him that spring, he had left Kate with nothing but an empty cabin and a note of debt owed to a man named Silas Pruitt. Pruitt owned half of Leadville and wanted to own the other half, and he had made it clear that Kate could work off her father's debt in his saloon as one of his girls. Kate had chosen to run instead. She was 22 years old, tall and strong from years of helping her father work his small mining claim, and she would rather die free in these mountains than live as Pruitt's property. So she had packed what little she owned, taken her father's old mare, and ridden east into the wilderness. Now, staring down at that thread of smoke, Kate felt the first flutter of hope she had experienced in days. Smoke meant people, meant shelter, meant perhaps someone who would not ask too many questions about a woman traveling alone. She urged her horse down the rocky slope, her long auburn hair whipping around her face in the mountain wind. Jonas was standing in his corral when he saw her coming. His first thought was that she must be lost because women simply did not travel alone through this country. His second thought, as she drew closer, and he could see the exhaustion written in every line of her body, was that she must be running from something. He set down the hammer he had been using to repair a fence post and walked slowly toward the edge of his property, trying not to startle her. Kate pulled up her horse 20 feet away, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. Jonas saw a woman with a face that would have been beautiful if not for the dirt and fear etched into it, green eyes that looked haunted and defiant in equal measure. She saw a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself, all hard muscle and weathered skin, with dark eyes that gave nothing away, and a fresh bandage wrapped around his upper arm. "I do not mean any trouble," Kate said, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. "I just need water for my horse and maybe directions to the nearest town that's not Leadville." Jonas noticed how she swayed slightly in her saddle, how her knuckles were white where they gripped the reins. "You look half dead," he said bluntly. "When did you last eat?" Kate blinked at him, surprised by the question. "Yesterday morning, I think. Or maybe the morning before. I do not quite remember." He made a decision then, one that went against every cautious instinct 5 years of solitary living had instilled in him. But there was something about the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held herself upright despite obvious exhaustion, that reminded him of a young doe he had once found, caught in a deadfall, terrified and hurting, but still fighting with everything it had. "Get down," he said. "I will see to your horse and you can eat something before you fall off and break your neck." Kate hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of accepting help from a strange man against the very real fact that she was near collapse. Finally, she dismounted, her legs nearly buckling as her feet hit the ground. Jonas was there in an instant, one large hand gripping her elbow to steady her. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such a big man, and Kate found herself looking up at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she managed. He just grunted and led her horse toward a water trough, leaving Kate to follow on unsteady legs. She watched as he unsaddled the mare with efficient practiced movements, checked her hooves, and gave her a portion of grain from his own stores. The care he took with the animal eased something in Kate's chest, made her think that perhaps she had stumbled upon one of the rare good men who still existed in this hard country. Inside his cabin, Jonas directed her to a chair near the fire and set about making coffee and frying salt pork with beans. Kate sat in stunned silence, looking around at the space he had created. It was rough but clean, everything in its place, the cabin of a man who had learned to take care of himself. There were furs on the walls and a bearskin rug on the floor, a cast-iron stove that radiated blessed warmth, and shelves lined with supplies and books, more books than she would have expected a mountain man to own. "You live here alone?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded like an accusation, or worse, an invitation. 5 years now," Jonas replied without turning from the stove. "Built this place myself after I mustered out of the cavalry." He did not elaborate, and Kate did not press. She had her own secrets, after all. When he handed her a plate of food, she fell on it like a starving wolf, manners forgotten in the face of genuine hunger. Jonas watched her eat with an expression that might have been concern or might have been calculation. She could not tell which. Finally, with warm food in her belly and coffee chasing away some of the cold exhaustion, Kate felt human enough to meet his eyes. "My name is Kate Wells," she said, "and I am running from a man named Silas Pruitt in Leadville. He says my father owed him money, says I belong to him now to work off the debt. I would rather die than go back there." It was perhaps too much honesty, too much vulnerability to lay at the feet of a stranger, but Kate was beyond caring. She needed him to understand that she could not go back, no matter what. Jonas was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he said, "Pruitt is a snake. I have heard of him. If you go back, you will not come out again." "I know. So what will you do?" Kate had been asking herself that same question for 3 days. "I was hoping to get to Denver, maybe find work there as a seamstress or a laundress, something honest, but I do not have any money, and I do not know if my horse can make the journey." Jonas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His wounded arm throbbed dully, a reminder of the previous night's violence, and he was suddenly, profoundly tired of being alone. It was a dangerous thought, one that could lead to complications he did not need. But looking at Kate Wells, at the way she held her chin up despite her fear, he found himself saying, "You can stay here for a few days, rest your horse and yourself. After that, we will figure out what comes next." Kate's eyes widened. "I could not impose like that." "You are not imposing if I am offering. You do not know anything about me." "I know you would rather run than compromise yourself," Jonas said quietly. "I know you are brave and stubborn and probably foolish, riding alone through this country. That is enough." Something shifted in Kate's chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear she had been carrying. She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the walls she had built around herself, but she was so tired, and his offer was so unexpected and genuine that she found herself nodding instead. "Just for a few days," she said, "until I'm strong enough to continue." "Just for a few days," Jonas agreed, and neither of them believed it for a moment. That first night, Jonas gave Kate his bed, a rope frame with a corn husk mattress that was far more comfortable than it had any right to be, and made himself a pallet near the fire. He lay awake for hours, listening to her breathing gradually deepen into sleep, wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had fought off rustlers in the darkness just the night before, had nearly died defending what was his, and now he had invited a stranger into his home, a woman who brought trouble with her like a shadow. But when morning came and he woke to find Kate already up, stoking the fire and attempting to make coffee with his supplies, Jonas found that he did not regret his decision. She looked better with rest, the color returning to her cheeks, though wariness still lingered in her eyes. "I thought I should earn my keep," she said, nodding toward the coffee pot. "Though I should warn you, I'm better with a pickaxe than a cookpot." Jonas allowed himself a small smile. "It cannot be worse than what I usually make." They were both wrong. The coffee was truly terrible, bitter and overboiled, but they drank it anyway, and there was something almost companionable about sharing the awful brew. Over breakfast, which Kate insisted on making and which turned out marginally better than the coffee, they talked in fits and starts, trading small pieces of their stories like currency. Jonas learned that Kate had grown up following her father from mining camp to mining camp, that her mother had died when she was young, and that she could handle a rifle, ride like a Comanche, and had once knocked out a man who had tried to force his attentions on her. Kate learned that Jonas had served 5 years in the cavalry before mustering out, that he preferred the solitude of the mountains to the company of men, and that he read poetry in the evenings when the loneliness grew too sharp. It was that last detail that surprised her most. "Poetry?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. Jonas shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "A man needs something to keep his mind from going soft. I've read Shakespeare so many times I can recite half of it." "I would like to hear that sometime," Kate said without thinking, then blushed at the implication that she would be staying long enough for such things. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Kate insisted on helping with chores, despite Jonas's protests that she was supposed to be resting. She mended his clothes, cleaned his cabin more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in years, and proved surprisingly capable with the cattle, moving among them with a calm confidence that spoke of experience with animals. Jonas found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way the morning sun caught the auburn lights in her hair, the way she laughed when one of the calves tried to suckle on her fingers. In the evenings they sat by the fire and talked. Jonas told her about the fight with the Rustlers, showed her the healing wound on his arm. Kate told him about her father, about the good years before the gambling took hold, about watching him waste away with fever while she held his hand and prayed for a miracle that never came. "I'm sorry," Jonas said quietly. Losing a parent is hard. You lost yours too? My father died in a farming accident when I was 16. My mother followed him 2 years later. I think her heart just gave out from grief. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. That is when I joined the cavalry. Seemed like a better option than trying to work the farm alone. Do you miss it? The cavalry, I mean. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. I miss the brotherhood sometimes, the sense of purpose. But I do not miss the killing. I saw things during the Indian Wars that still keep me awake at night. He glanced at her, his dark eyes serious. Out here, the only thing I have to fight is the weather and the occasional rustler. That's enough for me. Kate understood. She had seen her share of violence in the mining camps, had learned early that the world could be cruel and arbitrary. Finding peace was rare and precious, worth protecting. On the 4th day of her stay, Jonas took Kate with him to check on the far pasture where he kept his cattle during the summer months. It was a steep climb up the mountainside, the trail narrow and rocky, but Kate kept pace without complaint. When they reached the high meadow, she stopped and simply stared. The view was breathtaking. The whole valley spread out below them, mountains rising in every direction like the walls of some vast natural cathedral. "It is beautiful," she breathed. Jonas stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "This is why I stay," he said. "A man could search his whole life and never find anything better than this." Kate looked up at him, at the way the wind moved his long hair, at the strength in his profile, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was dangerous, this feeling, this growing awareness of him as more than just her rescuer. She had promised herself she would move on, would not bring her trouble to his doorstep permanently. But standing there in the high meadow with the world spread out below them, she found it increasingly hard to remember why leaving had seemed so important. They were heading back down the trail when they heard horses. Jonas immediately went still, one hand moving to the rifle he always carried in the high country. Kate felt her heart leap into her throat, fear flooding through her veins like ice water. Had Pruitt's men found her? Had they tracked her here? But the riders who emerged from the tree line were not Pruitt's men. There were 2 of them, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and harder faces, and Jonas recognized one of them immediately. The man had a bandage wrapped around his left thigh, and even from a distance, Jonas could see the stiffness in how he sat his saddle. The wounded rustler from the fight 4 nights ago. "Well, well," the man said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "If it is not the son of a bitch who shot me, I have been looking forward to this." Jonas stepped in front of Kate, his body a wall between her and danger. "You should have kept riding," he said, his voice flat and calm despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. "I gave you a chance to leave." "You gave me a bullet in the leg," the rustler snarled. "That is what you gave me, and now I am going to return the favor, except I am going to take my time about it." His eyes slid past Jonas to Kate, and his smile turned ugly. "That is a pretty woman you have got there. Maybe we will have some fun with her before we burn your cabin to the ground." Kate felt Jonas's muscles coil like a spring ready to snap. She put one hand on his back, feeling the tension thrumming through him. "How many bullets do you have?" she whispered. "Enough," he replied, not taking his eyes off the 2 men. Then, louder, he called out, "There are 2 of you and 1 of me with a rifle already aimed at your chest. Your friend there is smart enough to know how this ends. The question is whether you are." The second rustler, a younger man with a nervous twitch, shifted in his saddle. "Jake, maybe we should just go. This is not worth dying over." "Shut up, Billy," Jake snapped. But there was uncertainty in his eyes now. He could see the absolute steadiness of Jonas's rifle, could see the cold calculation in the mountain man's face, and he was remembering that this was the same man who had fought off 3 of them in the pitch darkness and still managed to wound him. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Kate barely breathed, her hand still pressed against Jonas's back, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. She realized with a sudden clarity that she trusted him completely, trusted him to protect her, trusted him with her life. Finally, Jake spat into the dirt and jerked his horse's head around. "This is not over," he snarled. "You hear me? This is not over." "Yes, it is," Jonas said quietly. "You come back here again, and I will not aim for your leg. Now get off my land before I change my mind about letting you leave at all." They rode off, Billy casting nervous glances back over his shoulder until they disappeared into the trees. Jonas did not lower his rifle until the sound of their hooves had faded completely, and even then he remained tense and watchful. "Will they come back?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe. Probably not. Men like that are bullies. They want easy targets, not fights they might lose." He finally turned to look at her, and Kate saw something fierce and protective blazing in his dark eyes. "But I will not let anyone hurt you. I swear that." The words hit Kate like a physical force. No one had ever looked at her the way Jonas was looking at her now, like she was something precious and worth defending. Her father had loved her, but he had been weak, unable to protect even himself in the end. Jonas was different. Jonas was strong and capable and absolutely certain. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Jonas was silent for a long moment, and Kate thought perhaps he would not answer. Then he said, "Because you fought your way here. Because you would rather risk everything than give up who you are. Because when I look at you, I do not feel quite so alone anymore." He paused, then added quietly, "Because I think I am starting to fall in love with you, Kate Wells, and that terrifies me more than any Rustlers ever could." Kate's breath caught in her throat. She should say something, should respond to that raw honesty, but words seemed inadequate. So instead, she did the only thing that made sense. She stepped closer and kissed him. Jonas froze for one heartbeat, two, and then his free arm came around her waist, pulling her tight against his broad chest. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning the shape of each other. But then Kate made a small sound in the back of her throat, and Jonas deepened the kiss, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head. And suddenly, there was nothing tentative about it at all. They kissed like people drowning, like they had been waiting their whole lives for this moment and could not get enough. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kate rested her forehead against Jonas's chest. She could hear his heart hammering, could feel the barely controlled tremor in his arms where he held her. "I was supposed to leave," she said into his shirt. "I was supposed to rest for a few days and then move on to Denver." "I know, but I do not want to leave. I want to stay here with you, if you will have me." Jonas pulled back enough to look down at her face, his expression almost wondering. "I have nothing to offer you except this rough cabin and a herd of cattle, and a life that will be harder than anything you can imagine. Winters here are brutal. Some years we will barely scrape by. And there is always the risk, rustlers, wild animals, accidents. I could not bear it if something happened to you because of me." Kate reached up and cupped his bearded jaw in her hand. "You are offering me freedom," she said fiercely. "You are offering me a chance to build something real, something that belongs to me and not to some man who thinks he owns me. That is everything, Jonas. That is more than I ever hoped for." He turned his face to kiss her palm, a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. "Then stay," he said roughly. "Stay and help me build a life here. Stay and let me spend every day earning the right to be the man you deserve." They married 3 weeks later, standing in Jonas's high meadow with only the mountains as witnesses and the words from a battered Bible Jonas's mother had given him. Kate wore her cleanest dress, and Jonas had trimmed his beard and tied his long hair back with a new leather cord. They spoke their vows with absolute certainty, with no doubts or hesitations, and when Jonas kissed his bride, Kate felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of rightness she had never experienced before. The weeks that followed were a revelation to them both. Jonas had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to laugh with, to simply share space with in comfortable silence. Kate had spent so many years caring for her dying father and then running from Pruitt that she had forgotten what peace felt like, what it meant to be somewhere she was wanted and valued, not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. They worked together to prepare for winter, cutting wood and smoking meat, and making sure the cabin was properly chinked against the cold that would come. Kate proved herself invaluable, her strength and stamina surprising Jonas, even though he should have known better. She could swing an axe for hours, could haul water and tend the cattle and still have energy to cook a hot meal at the end of the day. But it was the evenings Jonas loved most, when they would sit by the fire, and Kate would ask him to recite the poetry he had mentioned that first morning. He was self-conscious at first, embarrassed by his rough voice stumbling over Shakespeare's elegant phrases, but Kate listened with such genuine pleasure that his awkwardness faded. Sometimes she would fall asleep with her head on his shoulder, and Jonas would sit very still, marveling at the weight of her, at the trust implicit in her rest. They made love slowly at first, learning each other's bodies with the same care they had learned each other's minds. Jonas was terrified of hurting her. He was so large, so much stronger than she was. But Kate had no such fears. She came to him with a fierce passion that matched his own, and in the intimate darkness of their shared bed, they forged a connection that went bone deep. "I did not know it could be like this," Kate whispered one night, her head pillowed on Jonas's broad chest, his arms wrapped around her like he could shield her from the entire world. "I thought marriage was just a transaction, a means to an end. But this, what we have, it feels like coming home." Jonas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I know exactly what you mean. I spent 5 years convincing myself I was better off alone, that needing someone was a weakness. But you have shown me I was wrong. Loving you has made me stronger, not weaker." Kate tilted her face up to look at him in the firelight. "Do you think Pruitt will come looking for me?" It was a fear she rarely voiced, but Jonas knew it was always there, lurking at the edges of her happiness. "If he does, I will handle it," he said firmly. "You are my wife now, Kate. No one takes what is mine." She smiled at the possessive growl in his voice. "And you are mine, Jonas Garrett. Do not forget that." "Never," he promised, and sealed it with a kiss. October brought the first real snow, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but served as a warning of what was to come. Jonas began making longer trips down to the small settlement of Fairplay to trade furs and stock up on supplies they would need. Kate went with him on the second trip, curious to see the town and wanting to meet the few neighbors Jonas counted as something approaching friends. Fairplay was a rough place, typical of mining settlements scattered throughout the Colorado Territory, but it was relatively civilized compared to the wild camps around Leadville. Jonas introduced Kate to the general store owner, a grizzled old man named Hank, who had been one of the first settlers in the region. Hank looked Kate over with shrewd eyes and then clapped Jonas on the shoulder. "About time you found yourself a woman," he said, grinning through his tobacco-stained beard. "I was starting to think you planned to die a hermit up on that mountain." "Some of us prefer quality over convenience," Jonas replied dryly, and Kate laughed. They were loading supplies onto their pack mule when a man approached them. He was well dressed by Fairplay standards, his suit relatively new and clean, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Kate felt a chill of recognition even before he spoke. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "I am looking for a young woman named Catherine Wells. I heard she might have passed through this area a few months back. Auburn hair, green eyes, about this tall." He held his hand up to indicate Kate's height, his gaze sliding over her without recognition. Jonas stepped between Kate and the stranger, his massive frame blocking her from view. "Why are you looking for her?" The man smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Her father owed me a significant sum of money before he died. I am simply trying to collect what is owed to me. It is a matter of honor, you understand." "I understand you are Silas Pruitt," Jonas said flatly, "and I understand you should get back on your horse and return to Leadville before you find more trouble than you are looking for." Pruitt's smile vanished. "I do not believe I gave you my name. You did not need to. Your reputation precedes you." Jonas crossed his arms over his chest, every inch of him radiating barely controlled violence. "Now, I do not know anything about this Catherine Wells, but even if I did, I would not tell a snake like you. So unless you have business here that does not involve intimidating women and collecting debts from dead men, I suggest you move along." For a moment, Pruitt's mask slipped, and Kate saw the cold calculation beneath. He was weighing the situation, trying to decide if Jonas was worth the trouble. His eyes flicked past Jonas to Kate, and she saw the moment of recognition, saw him start to speak. Then Hank appeared beside them, a shotgun cradled casually in his arms. "Problem here, Jonas?" "Just a visitor who was about to leave," Jonas said, not taking his eyes off Pruitt. Pruitt looked from Jonas to Hank to the other townspeople who had started to gather, drawn by the tension in the air. He was a powerful man in Leadville, but here he had no influence, no leverage. Slowly, his practiced smile returned. "My apologies," he said, though his tone made it clear he meant nothing of the kind. "I did not mean to cause any trouble. If you do happen to hear anything about Miss Wells, I would appreciate word being sent to me in Leadville. There is a reward for information leading to her whereabouts." He tipped his hat and walked back to his horse, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Kate did not breathe until he had ridden out of sight. Then her knees went weak, and Jonas caught her, pulling her tight against his chest. "He saw me," she whispered. "He recognized me. I know he did." "Maybe," Jonas said grimly. "But he is not foolish enough to try anything here with witnesses, and he knows now that you are not alone and unprotected." Hank spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "That man is poison. You two watch yourselves heading back up the mountain. Men like Pruitt do not take rejection well." Jonas nodded, his jaw tight. "We will be careful." They left Fairplay within the hour, both of them tense and watchful. Jonas kept his rifle across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the trees on either side of the trail. Kate rode close beside him, her own father's old pistol now belted at her waist. The peace they had built over the past month suddenly felt fragile, threatened by Pruitt's reappearance. "I should leave," Kate said suddenly, the words bursting out of her. "I should go to Denver or San Francisco, somewhere far enough away that Pruitt cannot find me. I will not let him hurt you because of me." Jonas pulled his horse to a stop so abruptly that Kate nearly ran into him. He turned in his saddle, his dark eyes blazing. "You are my wife," he said, each word deliberate and fierce. "You are not going anywhere. We face this together, Kate. That is what marriage means. We stand together against whatever comes." "But no." He reached across the space between their horses and gripped her hand. "I fought 3 rustlers in the dark to protect a herd of cattle. Do you honestly think I would not fight 10 times that number to protect you? You are worth more to me than anything else in this world, so no more talk of leaving. We are in this together." Kate felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You are the stubbornest man I have ever met." "You married me anyway." "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I did." They made it back to the cabin without incident, but Jonas immediately began taking precautions. He set up a warning system of string and bells around the perimeter of his property, arranged the cabin so they would have clear lines of sight in all directions, and made sure both he and Kate kept weapons within easy reach at all times. It was not the way either of them wanted to live, but they had no choice. Pruitt knew where she was now, or at least knew the general area, and that made them vulnerable. The first real test came 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon was just a sliver in the sky. Jonas woke to the soft chime of one of his warning bells, a sound so faint most people would have missed it. But he had trained himself to sleep light, and he was on his feet with his rifle in hand before Kate had even opened her eyes. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert. "Someone is out there." Jonas moved to the window, peering out through the narrow gap between the shutters. At first, he saw nothing, just darkness and the vague shapes of trees. Then, movement caught his eye, a shadow separating from other shadows, moving slowly toward the cabin. Kate joined him at the window, her pistol gripped in both hands. "How many?" "At least 2, maybe more." Jonas's jaw clenched. "They are trying to circle the cabin, get us from multiple sides." It was exactly what he would have done in their position, and the tactical awareness told him these were not just random thieves or rustlers. These were men with training, men who knew what they were doing. Pruitt's men, almost certainly, sent to either kill them or drag Kate back to Leadville. Jonas made a decision. "Listen to me," he said, his voice barely audible. "There is a root cellar beneath the floor by the stove. I want you to get down there and stay hidden no matter what happens." "Absolutely not," Kate hissed. "I am not hiding while you fight them alone." "Kate! No!" She gripped his arm, her eyes fierce even in the darkness. "You said we face things together. You do not get to change the rules now because you are scared for me. I can shoot, Jonas. I can help defend our home." Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the cellar himself if that was what it took to keep her safe. But he also knew that stubborn set to her jaw, knew that she was right. He had said they faced things together, and he could not take that back just because the danger had become real. "Fine," he said tightly, "but you stay low. You do not take any stupid risks, and if I tell you to do something, you do it immediately. Agreed?" "Agreed." They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the cabin, each covering a different approach. Jonas's heart was pounding so hard, he thought Kate must be able to hear it across the room. This was different from fighting rustlers over cattle. This was fighting for the woman he loved, for the life they had built together, and the stakes could not be higher. The attack came with brutal swiftness. One moment there was silence, and the next, the cabin door exploded inward, torn off its hinges by some kind of battering ram. Two men rushed through the opening, guns drawn, and Jonas fired before they had cleared the threshold. His first shot took one man in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second shot went wide as Kate fired from her position, her bullet shattering the window and driving back a third man trying to climb through. The wounded man at the door returned fire wildly, bullets thudding into the log walls and smashing Jonas's sparse collection of dishes. Jonas worked the lever on his Winchester and fired again, and this time, the man went down and stayed down. But there were more coming. Jonas could hear them moving outside, shouting to each other, regrouping for another assault. "How many?" Kate called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "Too many," Jonas replied. He was calculating angles and odds, trying to figure out how they could possibly survive this. The cabin was defensible, but they could not hold it indefinitely against superior numbers. Eventually, the attackers would set fire to the place or simply wait them out, unless he changed the equation. "Kate," he said, "I need you to keep them busy for about 30 seconds. Can you do that?" "What are you going to do?" "Something stupid." Before she could protest, Jonas grabbed his rifle and a hunting knife, moved to the shattered door, and plunged out into the darkness. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all he had. The attackers expected them to stay pinned down in the cabin, expected a siege. They did not expect Jonas to come charging out like a madman, rifle blazing. He took them completely by surprise, emerging from the cabin like an avenging demon, his massive frame outlined against the faint light from inside. He fired as he ran, not aiming carefully, but simply laying down suppressing fire to scatter the men surrounding his home. Someone screamed, and Jonas felt a bullet tug at his shirt, missing his ribs by inches. Then he was in among them, using the rifle as a club because there was no time to reload, his fists and boots and sheer size becoming weapons. It was ugly, brutal, close-quarters fighting, the kind Jonas had hoped never to experience again after leaving the cavalry. He felt ribs crack under his fists, heard bones break when he threw one man against a tree. A knife slashed across his forearm, opening a long cut that immediately began bleeding, but Jonas barely noticed. He was operating on pure instinct and adrenaline, every ounce of his considerable strength focused on keeping these men away from Kate. From inside the cabin, Kate kept firing, providing cover, even though she could barely see what was happening. She had never been more terrified in her life, watching Jonas throw himself into danger for her, hearing the sounds of violence and not knowing if he was winning or losing. Then, suddenly, it was over. The men who could still move were running, crashing through the brush in their haste to escape the mountain man who fought like he was possessed. Jonas stood in the wreckage of his yard, breathing hard, blood running down his arm and dripping from his knuckles. He counted 4 men on the ground, 2 definitely dead, 2 groaning and trying to crawl away. The rest had fled. Kate burst from the cabin and ran to him, her hands immediately going to his wounds. "You idiot!" she sobbed, checking him over frantically. "You could have been killed. You could have—" Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He was shaking now, the aftermath of combat hitting him all at once. "I'm all right," he murmured into her hair. "I'm all right, and so are you, and that is all that matters." They dealt with the aftermath as the sun rose. The 2 dead men, they buried in shallow graves far from the cabin. The 2 wounded, Jonas tied up and left with their horses for when the local law finally made it up the mountain. He wanted everyone to know exactly who had attacked them and why, wanted there to be no question about who was in the wrong. 3 days later, a marshal from Fairplay arrived, accompanied by Hank and several other men from town. They listened to Jonas and Kate's account, examined the evidence, and questioned the wounded attackers. One of them talked readily enough once he realized he was facing a noose either way, confirmed that Pruitt had sent them, had offered a substantial bounty for Kate's return, dead or alive. The marshal was a hard-faced man named Tucker who had seen too much violence and had little patience for men like Pruitt. "This gives me everything I need," he said, tucking his notes into his coat. "Pruitt may be a big man in Leadville, But attempting kidnapping and murder crosses a line. I will be paying him a visit, and I will be bringing federal marshals with me when I do." "What about Kate?" Jonas asked. "What about the supposed debt?" Tucker waved a dismissive hand. "Any debt died with her father, and Pruitt knows it. He was using it as an excuse to acquire property, namely your wife. That is trafficking, and it is a hanging offense in this territory. Pruitt is finished." The relief Kate felt was so profound she nearly collapsed. Jonas caught her, as he always did, his strong arms supporting her weight. "It is over," he whispered. "It is really over." Marshal Tucker was as good as his word. News reached them a month later that Silas Pruitt had been arrested in Leadville, his empire dismantled, his assets seized. He would spend the rest of his life in prison if he was lucky enough to avoid the noose. The other men he had sent after Kate were similarly dealt with, and the few who had escaped Jonas's fury were wanted men with prices on their own heads. With the threat finally completely eliminated, Jonas and Kate could breathe freely for the first time since their marriage. Winter settled over the mountains in earnest, deep snows that isolated them from the world, and they spent those long, cold months building a life together inside their cabin. They talked for hours, read to each other, made love by firelight, and dreamed about the future. "I want children," Kate said one night, curled against Jonas's side. "I want to fill this cabin with noise and laughter and life." Jonas smiled, his hand splayed across her flat stomach. "How many children?" "At least 3, maybe 4, a whole houseful." She looked up at him. "What do you think?" "I think," Jonas said slowly, "that I would like nothing better than to see you round with my child, to watch our sons and daughters grow up strong and free in these mountains." He paused, then added, "But I also worry. Childbirth is dangerous out here, so far from doctors and help." Kate had thought about this too. "Then we will prepare. We will learn everything we can, gather supplies, make sure we are as ready as possible. And when the time comes, we will face it together, like we face everything else." "Together," Jonas agreed, and kissed her. Spring came with a rush of melting snow and budding trees, and with it came news that Kate was indeed pregnant. Jonas was so overcome with joy and terror that he could barely function for a week, alternating between grinning like a fool and worrying obsessively about everything that could go wrong. Kate bore his anxiety with patient amusement, feeling strong and healthy and more hopeful than she had ever been. They prepared throughout the summer, Jonas making trip after trip to Fairplay to consult with the settlement's midwife, an ancient woman named Mrs. Chen who had delivered more babies than she could count. She came up to the cabin twice to examine Kate and pronounced her healthy and capable of birthing without complications, barring the unexpected. "The mountain agrees with her," Mrs. Chen said, nodding sagely, "and she has good hips. She will do fine." Jonas blushed scarlet at this clinical assessment, and Kate laughed until tears streamed down her face. As Kate's belly grew, Jonas found himself falling in love with her all over again. She was beautiful pregnant, her skin glowing, her green eyes bright with happiness. He loved watching her move around the cabin, one hand resting on her stomach, talking to the baby as she worked. He loved the way she would grab his hand and place it on her belly so he could feel their child kick, her expression full of wonder. "Do you think it is a boy or a girl?" she asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the porch Jonas had built that spring. "Does it matter?" "Not even a little bit. I just like to imagine." Kate leaned her head on his shoulder. "If it is a boy, I want to name him Samuel, after my father. If it is a girl, I was thinking maybe Grace." "Samuel or Grace Garrett," Jonas said, testing the names. "I like both of those." Their son was born on a cold October morning, almost exactly a year after they had first met. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Jonas was certain he was going to lose either Kate or the baby or both. He had faced down Rustlers and Pruitt's hired guns without flinching, but listening to his wife's cries of pain broke something inside him. But Kate was strong, so much stronger than even she had known, and when dawn broke gray and pale, she delivered a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Jonas wept when Mrs. Chen placed his son in his arms, this tiny, perfect human that he and Kate had created together. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered, his voice rough. "Welcome to the world." Kate, exhausted and radiant, reached up to touch Jonas's face. "We did it," she said. We made something beautiful." "You did it," Jonas corrected. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Kate Garrett." Samuel was a good baby, healthy and curious, and Jonas discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved everything about his son: the weight of him, the baby smell, the way his tiny hand would grip Jonas's finger with surprising strength. He built a cradle that he kept beside their bed and would often wake in the night just to watch Samuel sleep, marveling that something so precious could exist. Kate recovered quickly from the birth and threw herself into motherhood with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. She nursed Samuel while reading poetry aloud, sang to him while working around the cabin, and narrated her entire day to him as if he could understand every word. "You are going to raise a very literate baby," Jonas observed one afternoon, watching her read Shakespeare to their 3-month-old son. "There is no such thing as starting too early," Kate replied primly. They were happy, genuinely and completely happy, in a way that neither of them had imagined possible. The cabin that had once felt too large for one man now felt perfectly sized for a family. Jonas expanded his herd, trading furs and selling cattle in fair play to ensure they had enough money for supplies and the occasional luxury. Kate started a garden that first summer after Samuel's birth, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with sheer determination. Years passed, measured in the rhythms of mountain life, harsh winters, and brief, brilliant summers, the slow expansion of their herd, the growth of their son. Samuel learned to walk holding onto his father's massive hands, learned to ride sitting in front of Jonas on his saddle, learned to read sitting in his mother's lap by firelight. He was a happy child, fearless and bright, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. When Samuel was 3, Kate became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a daughter with auburn hair and dark eyes, a perfect blend of both parents. They named her Grace, and Jonas fell in love all over again, this time with a tiny girl who wrapped him around her finger from the moment she was born. Ati. "I thought I understood what you meant about fighting your way into my heart every single day," Jonas told Kate one night, holding Grace while Samuel slept beside them. "But watching you with our children, seeing the life we have built together, I realize that you do not fight your way into my heart anymore. You are my heart, Kate. You and these babies. You are everything." Kate, tired and happy and more content than she had ever dreamed possible, smiled at her husband. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? You said you had nothing to offer me but a rough cabin and a hard life." "I remember." "You were wrong," she said softly. "You offered me everything that matters: love, safety, freedom, family. You gave me a home, Jonas. Not just a place to live, but a real home, the kind I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it." Jonas leaned over and kissed her, carefully so as not to disturb the sleeping baby in his arms. "I love you, Kate Garrett. Every single day for the rest of my life, I will be grateful that you fought your way into my heart." More years passed. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, taking over more and more of the work around the homestead. Grace proved to be as stubborn and determined as her mother, learning to ride and shoot and work alongside the men without complaint. Jonas's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Kate found laugh lines etched around her eyes, but neither of them minded. These were the marks of a life well lived, of joy and laughter and love that had endured. They had 2 more children, another son named Thomas and a daughter named Elizabeth, and the cabin Jonas had built for one now burst at the seams with noise and life. On summer evenings, they would all sit on the expanded porch Jonas had built, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Jonas would recite poetry while Kate leaned against his shoulder and their children sprawled around them. Samuel eventually married a girl from Fairplay, a pretty blonde named Sarah, who won Kate's approval by standing up to Jonas when he got too overbearing. They built a cabin on the far edge of Jonas's property and started their own herd, remaining close enough that the family could gather for dinners and holidays. Grace announced her intention to become a teacher and eventually opened a small school in Fairplay, riding down the mountain each morning with the fearlessness she had inherited from both her parents. Thomas and Elizabeth were still young, still figuring out who they would become, but Jonas and Kate had no doubts they would grow into remarkable people. On a warm summer evening, when Samuel was 25 and Kate was approaching 50, she and Jonas sat together on their porch, watching their grandchildren, Samuel and Sarah's 3 boys play in the yard. Kate's hand rested in Jonas's, their fingers intertwined with the ease of decades. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked suddenly. "Running away from Leadville all those years ago, everything you went through to get here?" Kate looked at him, this man who had become her entire world, whose strength had sheltered her and whose love had transformed her. She thought about the terrified young woman who had ridden into his camp so many years ago, thought about everything they had survived and built together. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Every hard mile, every moment of fear, every risk I took, it was worth it to get here, to you, to this life. You saved me, Jonas." "No," Jonas said, lifting her hand to his lips. "You saved me. I was just existing before you arrived, going through the motions of living without really understanding what life could be. You taught me how to love, how to be part of something bigger than myself. You fought your way into my heart every single day, and you made me a better man than I ever could have been alone." Kate smiled, that same fierce, determined smile Jonas had fallen in love with all those years ago. "We saved each other then. We fought for each other, and we built something beautiful together." "Yes," Jonas agreed, pulling her close. "Yes, we did." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red and purple, Jonas and Kate Garrett sat together in perfect contentment, surrounded by the life they had created, secure in a love that had been forged in hardship and tested by fire, and had emerged stronger than either of them could have imagined. The Wild West was changing, becoming tamer and more civilized with each passing year. But here in their mountain sanctuary, Jonas and Kate had built something timeless, a love story that would be passed down through their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of 2 people who had been willing to fight for each other, for their future, for the life they wanted to build together. Jonas had fought 3 rustlers in the dark all those years ago to protect what was his. But Kate had fought her way into his heart every single day since. And in the end, that was the greater victory, the greater triumph. They had won something precious and rare, a love that endured, a partnership that strengthened with time, a family that would carry their legacy forward into the future. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jonas pressed a kiss to Kate's temple and whispered, "Every single day I choose you. Every single day I would fight for you. Every single day I love you more than the day before." Kate's eyes shone with tears of happiness. "And every single day I fight my way deeper into your heart until there is no space left that does not belong to us." "There never was," Jonas said. "From the moment I saw you riding toward my cabin, exhausted and terrified but still fighting, my heart was yours. It will always be yours." They sat together as the night settled around them, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a life and a love that would echo through the generations. The mountains stood eternal around them, silent witnesses to a love story that had begun with a mountain man fighting 3 rustlers in the dark and a woman brave enough to fight her way into his heart every single day until they were so intertwined that neither could imagine existing without the other. It was a happy ending, hard-won and well-deserved, the kind of ending that only comes to those brave enough to fight for it. And Jonas and Kate Garrett, having fought and won, lived out their days in peace and love and happiness, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had found something most people only dream of, a love that lasted forever, a partnership that made them both stronger, and a life filled with more joy than either of them had thought possible. The Wild West faded into history, but their love remained, eternal as the mountains themselves.